If it's your first time joining us, a special welcome to you. And if you'd like to view past sessions of the series, you can search Times of Crisis and Possibility on the JTS website. We're so pleased to have Dr. Alan Cooper here today for A Time to Weep, the Power of Lament in Times of Crisis, looking at biblical literature. And we've kind of entered into a sort of a mini series on literature within our larger series. Last week we looked at literature of the ghetto with Dr. Edna Friedberg. Next week we'll be looking at Israeli literature with Dr. Barbara Mann. And today we've stepped back in time to look at biblical literature with Professor Cooper and explore that as a genre of expression during times of crisis. So I will introduce Dr. Cooper more fully in a moment, but so pleased that everyone has joined us for this special session. Just a few announcements and technical instructions. I want to thank Rabbi Tim Bernard, our Director of Digital Learning, who will be facilitating the session today, and several of their members of the community engagement team who have been part of putting the series together. To make sure that you're seeing Dr. Cooper close up, you probably want to select speaker view rather than gallery view. That's usually on the top right of your Zoom window. For questions, Dr. Cooper will be pausing periodically throughout the class for questions, and we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. And we'll use the raise hand feature in Zoom, which you're probably familiar with by now, but if not, you want to click on participants, that bar at the bottom, and then you look for a hand icon. So you click that to raise or lower your hand. Feel free to go ahead and test it out. And if you're participating by phone, you can raise or lower your hand by dialing *9. And Tim will call on you when it's your turn. He'll call on you by name, and then you will unmute yourself to ask your question. We will likely do a little bit of screen sharing today, at least a little bit. And if you want to change the proportional size of the image being shared versus Dr. Cooper's image, just so you know, you can, there are view options there, and you can move the vertical line back and forth in order to make one or the other of those two windows bigger. You should receive the sources by email, and I saw that Stacy also just posted them in the chat. So I think that's all of the logistical information we need. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Cooper, who is the Elaine Ravich Professor of Jewish Studies at JTS. He joined the faculty in 1997 as a professor of Bible, and he's since then has held many positions, including Director of Publications, Chair of the Bible Faculty, and Provost of JTS for several years. In 1998, he was appointed Professor of Bible at the Union Theological Seminary, which is the non-denominational Christian seminary across the street from us in New York, and then became the first person to hold concurrent professorships at both JTS and Union. He previously taught Bible at Hebrew Union College and religious studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And his publications include a monograph on Canaanite divine names that appear in the Hebrew Bible, and many articles on biblical poetics and the history of interpretation. And his current work in progress includes a commentary on, I think, 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms, which will be one volume of the Jewish Publication Society's forthcoming 5-volume commentary on the Book of Psalms. And I just want to say, on a sort of personal, professional note, that Professor Cooper has always been a real champion of community learning at JTS. Especially during his time as provost, he really supported the growth of our community learning programs. So we're especially pleased to have him today. And Dr. Cooper, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. And I want to add my thanks, except not to myself. I want to add my thanks to the wonderful staff of our community engagement program, Rabbi Yandelman, Rabbi Bernard, and everyone else who has contributed to developing this and so many other wonderful programs that provide learning for our community. I'd like to wish you happy Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. It's the first day of the month of Tammuz. And that actually has a surprising tie-in to today's topic, because first of all, it's very nice to have one of our months named after one of the most ancient pagan deities, the god who is known as Tammuz, or in his earlier Sumerian name, Dumuzi, who belongs to the category of gods that the Bible most furiously rejects, namely those gods who die and revive, who die with the summer heat and then are revived and provide fertility of the land during the fertile season. And this is relevant today because he has a consort whose name is Inanna in Sumerian and Ishtar in Akkadian, and the marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi, or Ishtar and Tammuz, comes to an unhappy conclusion every year when Tammuz dies, and that occasions some of the most ancient laments that we have in ancient Near Eastern literature, the lament of Inanna or the lament of Ishtar for the death of Tammuz or Dumuzi. And that, of course, allows me to say that the stuff we're beginning to be talking about today belongs to one of the oldest genres of literary and religious expression that we have any attestation of, namely the genre of lament. And I'll say much more about that in a few minutes. Second thing I'd like to say by way of greeting is Happy Pride Month. And I don't know how well you can see this, but I am taking advantage of the opportunity to wear my JTS Pride shirt in honor of the month, in honor of the occasion, and more importantly, in honor of what it signifies for us and for our community and for the world. And last week's Supreme Court decision, which took a lot of people by surprise, gives me another occasion to wear this shirt by way of celebration. Before talking specifically about lament, what I'd like to do is say just a word about prayer, the phenomenon of prayer as I understand it, because it can be regarded as something very complicated or something very simple. And simple person that I am, what I'd like to do is discuss it in very simple terms. It seems to me that prayer provides us with two opportunities. One is the opportunity to look hard internally, to provide us with opportunity and occasion for self-reflection. Who am I? How have I been? How can I improve? What have I done wrong? These prayers open up the possibility for us to reflect on those matters. But the second thing that prayer enables us to do, which is opposite the first thing, self-reflection is the first thing. The second is to allow us to connect with something outside ourselves, something that is larger, something that's greater, something that's just not within ourselves. And those connections usually will take one of two forms. Either connection with the community. There's nothing about praying alone that isn't exceeded by the value of praying with others in community. And this present crisis of the pandemic has certainly harmed many of our opportunities to pray together as a community and to benefit from that communal experience. And then, of course, the great other, the other being God, or the thing that's out there that's greater for us and to which we are in some sense answerable, is something to whom we pray as well. So we pray for purposes of internal self-reflection and for purposes of getting ourselves out of ourselves, into the world, into community, into relationship with whatever it is that we think holds sway over the universe and gives it some order and some sense and some meaning. The lament per se, as a form of prayer, as I've already mentioned, is one of the oldest literary and religious genres, but it particularly came to the fore in our culture following the disaster of 9/11, 2001. And at that point, people recognized the value of a genre of lament that has been known for 4,000 years and that is ubiquitous. You can find examples of this worldwide, namely laments specifically for the destruction of great cities, laments for the destruction of the city of Ur, a lament for the destruction of the city of Sumer. A few years ago, I had a student who grew up in mainland China who had gained expertise in classical Chinese literature, and she wrote her doctoral dissertation comparing imagery in the Book of Lamentations with imagery in classical Chinese poetry that had been written to lament the destruction of great Chinese imperial cities. The commonalities of imagery are so shocking and so surprising, even though the Chinese literature was written out of a non-theistic system that didn't cry out or appeal to God or blame God for what people were suffering, but thought more in terms of fate and destiny. Nevertheless, this idea of communities coming together to lament moments of great crisis, moments of great suffering, moments of destruction is so ubiquitous and so widespread and so ancient. And so when we talk about reviving the phenomenon of lament for practical purposes, for spiritual and psychological purposes in our own time, what we're doing is simply redoing what's been done time and time again in the lives of religious individuals and communities, and not so religious individuals and communities for as long as there's been civilization, maybe even before that. So with that, what I'd like to do is share a screen for a very brief moment to talk about Latter-day Lament in its, first I have to find the screen that I want to share, but that will only take me a moment, I hope. Let's see, let's exit this. You kind of get used to the fact that the technology is, there we go. Okay, there's what we want to share. Now we go back here. And where is it? No, I can't find it. Here it is. Okay, share. Okay. This comes from the New York Times of June 11th, that famous collection of religious literature. And what it is from a business section article about what has befallen the employees of a small neighborhood bar and restaurant in Oakland, California, as a result of the closure occasioned by the pandemic. And it's a situation in which people go from being okay to being bad to being worse, and how they respond to it. And one of the individuals is this fellow, you can see him at the beginning of the paragraph, whose name is Santos. And you can see what kind of person he is, this excerpt here from the Times. Santos is the sort of man who blesses you when he meets you. Que Dios bendiga, he says, may God bless you. And when you ask him how he is, he often replies, bien, gracias a Dios, thanks, well, thanks to God. In using this language, he is using the most ancient prayerful language of blessing that we actually have extant in literary documents, certainly among Israelite literary documents. One of the oldest inscriptions in the Hebrew language is an inscription that is on a part of a clay jug that comes from a place called Kuntelat Adrud and dates from the late 9th or early 8th century BCE. And what it is, it seems to be a graffito written by a traveler who writes, among other things, V'achti etchem l'Adonai. In other words, wishing travelers safe trip in which they will be beneficiaries of divine blessing. May you be blessed to Adonai, meaning that I invoke God's blessings for you so that you may have a safe journey. And look at what Santos says. When you part ways, he offers another blessing for the road. Kuntelat Adrud, a little graffito from the 9th century BCE, and this fellow who's suffering increasingly from unemployment during the time of pandemic. And then what happens to our character here, Santos, is as his situation grows worse, which you can see here in this little excerpt from the article, he now has only 15 hours a week of work. He can't afford to make his rent. His children are suffering. And finally, they continue to pray each night, writes the author of the Times article. Humanity has reached an extreme that has offended God, so we ask for mercy, he recited to me. So this is his prayer. And what we're going to see in just a moment is that all he's doing is repeating the language and sentiment of prayers of lament that people have uttered from time immemorial in more or less formal ways. This is an informal, spontaneous outburst of prayer on his part, and yet it is the restatement of a kind of prayerful idea that we find again and again in the literature, both formal and informal. Now, what's interesting about this? Humanity has reached an extreme that has offended God. Number one, what's the source of suffering? The source of suffering is God. In other words, whatever the existential circumstances of the virus, of the employment situation, of his ethnicity, of whatever it is that he might ascribe his suffering to, it all boils down not only to God, but to the fact that God is angry. This represents the sentiment that is universally shared in all prayers of lament from the very beginning to the present day. Number one, there's an explanation for this. Number two, it comes from outside. Number three, that the explanation has something to do with either what I have done or neglected to do, or what we collectively have done or failed to do, so we ask for mercy. So we throw ourselves on the mercy of the power that has brought about the suffering, whether we can offer anything to that external power or not, in order to try to obtain some kind of relief, some kind of redress. So now I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And what I'd like to do is make a transition to the more formal literary material that you have. If you wish to download it, I believe that it's now available as a PDF file in the chat. Or else what I can do is I can put it on screen also as soon as I find it, which I have to do, which will take me a moment. Or maybe, Tim, can you do that?
I can do that.
Okay, that would be great. So let me X that out. This is the regular handout. And now what I'd like to do is look with you at some Mesopotamian prayers that manifest the genre of lament, and then we'll look directly at biblical examples. So here is Tim putting the Mesopotamian laments here on screen. Wow, that's pretty fancy. Okay, so these are examples of two genres of Mesopotamian laments that come from copies that are more or less contemporary with probably early biblical psalms of lament, but date back to a much more ancient tradition. And you'll get a sense of what these laments are about from the names of the genres that are assigned to them in Mesopotamian literature. One is called, in its Sumerian equivalent, Shahunga, which means a lament, for calming the heart. Calming the heart. Again, just as in the case of Santos, the assumption is that what we're suffering is a manifestation of divine anger. Do I know what's caused the divine anger? Well, maybe I have an inkling, maybe I don't. And this calls to mind one of the most fundamental religious concepts that we have to try to keep in mind when we study and when we use literature of lament. And that's the difference between what we might call a covenantal religion or a covenantal religious idea and a notion of the relationship with God that belongs more to the realm of personal religion. By covenantal religion, I'm talking about the kind of religious idea that's embedded in the book of Deuteronomy, which basically says, if you're good, you're going to be rewarded, and if you're bad, you're going to be punished, which creates tremendous opportunity for cognitive dissonance, because you can say, like the author, like the character in the book of Job, I've been good, so why am I suffering? In other words, if there's a mechanical system according to which suffering and blessing are supposed to operate, then it's always subject to disconfirmation. In personal religion, there's a much more malleable relationship between the God and the individual. The God may be angry for all sorts of reasons. The metaphor sometimes is the metaphor, a parental metaphor, in which kids, they see that their parents are angry with them, but they may not know the reason why, or they may not understand anything about the proportionality between the anger that they're experiencing, the suffering that they're experiencing, and whatever it is that they might have done to have caused it. So all they want is to plead with the God, plead with the angry parent, to let go, to release, to provide relief, to show mercy. That was Santos. I know we've done all sorts of awful things. Humanity has so angered you, but please show mercy. That's the appeal to the personal God. So let's look at this first text, which is God of my family. I see a question from Zahav asking exactly the pertinent question. Does that mean that Judaism is a combination of the covenantal and the personal? And that's a brilliant question, because the answer is absolutely yes. That there's a sliding scale between the more abstract notion of God, in which we're in this contractual relationship with God, in the more personal relationship with God, in which we seek intimacy and in which we plead for relief in times of suffering on the basis not of covenantal relationship, but on the basis of God's love for us as God's children. So the answer is absolutely yes. And we have this sliding scale that moves back and forth. So let's look at this Mesopotamian lament. My God, my Lord, who created my name, guardian of my life, producer of my progeny. So in other words, the deity is responsible for everything good. My identity, for my fecundity. Oh, angry God, may your heart be calmed. What could be a more simple expression? This is the classic statement that you find in one of the principal genres of Mesopotamian lament, that I'm offering you this prayer in order to try to ease your anger, to soothe your anger, so that you'll be reconciled with me. And it's not as if I really know what's going on. Oh my God, where are you? Says this prayer. You have been angry with me, turn towards me. And then turn your face to the pure godly meal of fat and oil. So now we learn that this is in the context of some kind of a ritual performance in which some kind of sacrifice and oblation is being offered to the deity in the context of this prayer. Is that necessary? Does there have to be a cultic component to asking God for mercy, to asking God for relief? Well, there certainly isn't in Santos's improvised prayer, nor need there be in the private or communal utterance of any psalm. The other thing is, note how this begins. Oh, my God, my Lord. And let's, can we scroll down just a little bit here? Oh, stop, that's good. No, I didn't even need to do that. Here's where I'm looking. That's good. You who have been angry with me, turn towards me. What does that imply positionally? I mean, think about the 23rd Psalm, which says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, because you are with me. So what's the opposite of that? The opposite is, where are you? Turn towards me. Why don't I see you? Why don't I feel your presence? So feeling God's presence and the need to feel God's presence are an essential component of lament. So let's step back a bit and say that there are really two essential components that we're dealing with here. One is the need for relief from the existential situation. There's the existential crisis. I'm suffering, I'm in pain, I'm miserable. And then there's the psychological, spiritual crisis, which is I'm alone. Why, God, have you turned away from me? Where are you? Turn towards me. All of these Psalms of lament in the Bible and in the Mesopotamian tradition are Psalms that balance both of those elements, an existential crisis with a spiritual crisis. If you utter a lament on a sick bed, do you really expect to be healed automatically at the conclusion of the prayer? No. But do you think that you've established a connection with the source of healing that gives you some occasion for calming yourself, for experiencing hope, for alleviating your feeling of loneliness, of being alone, of being abandoned? That's how it works. The existential crisis may remain, but the spiritual crisis may be lifted even in this ancient Mesopotamian prayer. So here, in the first prayer, we see an example of an individual who is, offering something to God in the hope of gaining some kind of mercy in exchange. But look at the next one. It's quite different. Oh my God, I didn't know how harsh your punishment would be. I've sworn lightly a solemn oath by your name. So immediately there's a confessional statement. Remember when Santos said, we must have done something really awful to make you this angry. Well, here, it's not at the level of the community, which is a way of deflecting blame from the individual. Here, it's, I have done wrong. It's a confessional element. So think about the way we use confessional elements individually and collectively in our high holiday literature, in our high holiday liturgy, as a way of gaining favor, gaining self-knowledge, and as a way of gaining favor, we hope, with God. And look at how this confessional element goes. Oh, my crimes being so numerous, I do not know all I did. Oh my God, clear, forgo, dispel your ire, disregard my iniquities, accept my entreaties, transmute my sins into good deeds. There's an interesting anticipation of some Jewish mysticism in that too, this idea of transformation, transforming evil acts or sins into good deeds that can give us credit. So I've seen your punishment. And then there's something else that we find in biblical laments, which is what we might call the paranetic or teaching element. Let me serve as an example to you all, spoken to the community. Let him who does not revere his God and goddess learn from my example. You see, we're building a genre, we're creating a grammar, we're creating ways of using prayer to respond to an existential crisis that's also a spiritual crisis, that addresses the crisis as not only the personal suffering, but also the feeling of having been abandoned, of having one's God turn away. The presumption of personal religion. You notice both of these Psalms begin with an apostrophe. My God, oh my God. It's like making a phone call, call on the phone. Have you ever called on the phone and the phone's answered by a little kid? And the little kid hasn't been acculturated to how to answer the phone. So what happens is you call and you go, hello, 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 and you hear breathing, right? But there's no presence. You're calling, but there's no answer, and how frustrating it is, and how maddening that is. We have a biblical story about this. We have the biblical story of Samuel, the prophet, being called by God. And God is calling Samuel, and Samuel picks up the phone, and God says, hello, hello, and Samuel doesn't know how to respond, so Samuel is just there, unable to answer. But the presumption of beginning the prayer with my God is the oxymoron of, first of all, claiming to have been abandoned and ignored, and yet still reaching out to restore the presence of the one who has allegedly ignored. A way of alleviating the feeling of loneliness and abandonment is by means immediately of picking up the phone and calling, trying to establish a line of communication by the meta-communication, by the apostrophe of God. And the presumption here is in the notion that this God is ready to pick up the phone and listen. That little old me, somehow I matter to this God, and I want to matter, and it's vitally important for me to matter. And that justifies, even necessitates, my prayer. I'm going to now make a transition to looking at biblical equivalents or parallels to these old Mesopotamian Psalms and amplify on some of the, what I would call grammatical elements, some of the components of the genre of lament. But before doing that, I wonder if there are questions, issues that you would like to hear more about, or clarifications?
Elaine?
Hi, my screen just went blank.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Can you comment on the use of goddess in these prayers?
Alan, did you hear the question?
We might have lost him for a moment. I'm going to contact him separately. Hi, friends. I just spoke with Professor Cooper. His computer crashed. He is restarting and will be back with us in 1 minute. He said it's never happened before, so I don't know what to make of that.
Welcome back, Alan.
No, I'm fine. I remember I mentioned the dying and reviving God before. That was the dying and reviving computer. I apologize on behalf of my machine. And this is a different one. So this one's more This is more impressive though, because now I'm in my study where I have my books behind me, or a small component of my books. So you can be impressed that I must be a real scholar. Okay. Actually, there's a great old New Yorker cartoon that shows a wall full of books. And the caption says, "I don't even like to read. It was my decorator's idea." So that's this. All right. Well, now I'm ready to take questions, I think, from the first part of this talk. And then, okay.
I think the first question was asking about the mention of goddess in the laments we saw.
Oh, you don't want me to get started on that, do you? The Kuntalada Jud inscription that I mentioned with the blessing formulary for travelers actually is most famous because it's the same inscription that is on that clay vessel that mentions possibly the Israelite god having a consort named Asherah, who's well known from extra biblical literature. But in Judaism, once Israelite religion becomes more adamantly monotheistic, what we start to develop are what we might call feminine hypostases. Sorry for the fancy word, of God, which are understood to be part of God rather than separate from God, but which represent what you might call the reemergence of the goddess in Judaism. And those would be three in particular, three very important feminine words in the Hebrew language. One is Torah, a feminine personification, and one is Chokhmah, wisdom, Lady Wisdom, who's already personified in the opening 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs that way. And of course, Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is also the divine feminine. And these represent simply the reemergence of the goddess in Judaism, just as I would think that Mariology in early Christianity represents to a certain extent a similar phenomenon of reintroducing goddess imagery and a dea nutrix, a nourishing goddess, into the Christian religion as well. The more abstract and remote the monotheistic deity is, the less useful that deity is for purposes of religion. And that's why there are always these resurgences of personal religion in which one wants to see the reassertion of an intimate and personal relationship with God, whether it's through one of the sphirot of the mystical tradition, or whether it's through one of these personified attributes of deity or whatever. So it's a wonderful question, but was there actually worship of a goddess somewhere in ancient Israel, in some places and in some times? I think it's fairly certain that there was. and that was suppressed over time, particularly with the emergence of priestly religion as the dominant form of biblical religion in later biblical times. Again, that's a question that would lead us very far afield if we were to pursue it in detail. Other questions?
George?
The Lamentations from Mesopotamia used God in the singular. I presume the Mesopotamians were polytheistic, not monotheistic. Were these lamentations to a single, quote, lowercase God of their panoply of gods, or did they really have a monotheistic concept?
You know, I love questions like that when I can answer by saying yes. The answer is both and. There are a few basic things about ancient Near Eastern religion that you want to know. One of the terms that scholars use to describe the actual situation of most traditions of religion in the ancient Near East is the term henotheistic. That is to say that there's one God to whom I give my primary allegiance. I may even regard that deity as the ruler of a pantheon of gods, of lesser gods. But I don't deny the existence of these other gods. And if it's useful, then I'll pray to some of those other gods on occasion too. When I visited the great Hong Kong temple at Wang Tai Sin, I was fortunate to have a monk as my guide. And I went to observe some of the petitionary prayers that were being uttered there in the various parts of the shrine. And I asked my interpreter, ask this person to whom he is praying. And he did. And the answer was, to anyone who'll listen. Now, I thought that was a pretty powerful religious statement, you know, for somebody working in a system that's polytheistic. But that doesn't mean that one might not give to a personal deity, particularly associated with your family or with your clan. We have evidence of this in the patriarchal, matriarchal narratives in Genesis, right? Where you have the God of your father or the God of your fathers. That would be a personal God along the lines of the kind of God deity you're talking to. Pachad Yitzchak, the fear of Isaac, that kind of deity, which seems to represent the survival of a personal clan deity, the national God. And that's the other thing you have to keep in mind, is that there's always a tendency, what you might call a centripetal force. Once someone is designated as the official god of a kingdom, or the national god, or the god of a particular official shrine, then that god is like a vacuum cleaner, sucking up the characteristics and attributes and even the names of lesser deities, and in effect, kind of becoming them, if you know what I mean. So at the end of the Babylonian creation epic, there's a list of 70 names of Marduk, who is the patron god of the city of Babylon, whose temple for divine titles of the Israelite God, like Adonai Tzvaot, which we usually translate as Lord of Hosts, which is a good term for if you're in the hotel business. And Lord of Hosts, it really should be understood appositionally. Lord who is the hosts. In other words, the hosts are the lesser deities who form part of an ancient pantheon, who are all being assimilated into the character of the Israelite God as the system becomes more focused on the one national deity. So you're asking a really valuable time to be the all-powerful God of the universe, but at the same time, to be the one who walks beside us when we have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It's both and. Maybe one more question, and then we'll turn our attention to Psalm 13. Are there a lot more questions, Tim? I don't...
There are 2 questions at the moment, but I think we can just take one
Oh,
more.
2 is good. 2 is good.
Okay. Betsy?
Okay, sure. So here's my question. It's about lament in general. So, like, for example, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson said they went to, observe the native tribes and all the paraphernalia of the rain dance. And the chief, and they said, wow, you're doing all these rain dances for so long, and it hasn't rained, it's so upsetting. The chief said, we're not upset. We dance to be in the dancing attitude, not necessarily to make the rain. So what I'm wondering is, with a lament, when you feel so hopeless and you feel so, bad, especially in the Psalms, are we doing that to have the dancing attitude, to feel better so we don't, kill ourselves? Or do we really think that this lament is going to make the rain, that God's going to actually change his mind?
Well, I don't think you can give a single answer for a single person at a single time. I think people are going to have different attitudes towards that. In the Jewish tradition generally, we tend to look down on the notion of magical efficacy. In other words, if you utter a spell and you utter the charm correctly, then there's a guaranteed result. I mean, we've never really thought much of that idea, although, in popular religion, people do all the time. I'm offering you this sacrifice, so therefore you should grant me the petition that I've made. That kind of idea is prevalent. Even the biblical sacrificial laws in the book of Leviticus make it pretty clear that there's not exactly a quid pro quo. You can make all these offerings, you can make the prescribed offerings, you can make voluntary offerings, but it's still up to the free will of God to decide whether or not to accept the offering. V'nirtzah. In other words, God is willing to accept it and perhaps act on it, and one may carry that hope. But I think you've really put your finger on a crucial point, which is that it's about the attitude that I bring into the posture of prayer and the attitude that I emerge from the act of prayer with. This is going to be absolutely clear from our reading of Psalm 13. And I think there's one more question.
Table?
Hi, am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes.
So this may be a very simple answer. It may just be the no, but because you said Ishtar, and Ishtar, I always think about Esther, and there's a pairing of the male and female Marduk Ishtar. Is there any connection between the text you're looking at and Megillas Esther?
Well, let's just say that that's a topic for another day, if you don't mind. I think that would divert us to just a bit too much. The book of Esther is simultaneously one of the funniest and scariest books in the Bible. And I don't want to do it an injustice by offering a simplistic answer to a complicated question. But it's clear that those names, which reflect the names of ancient Mesopotamian deities, weren't just picked out of thin air for no reason. That also doesn't mean that there's any simple or long-standing agreed upon explanation. So I respect the question. I thank you for bringing it to our attention, but I think it would probably take us too far afield to deal with it in any meaningful detail here. So with respect, I'll just set it aside for another occasion. I did teach a seminar about this for rabbis a few years ago. Tim may remember that because he was the engineer on that occasion, or maybe not. Maybe it was his wife. Could be. Speaking of meaningless diversions, let's get back to our psalm. So I'm a little bit worried about having the screen shared after my last experience. So people have access to the PDF of Psalm 13. You don't need my PDF. All you need is Sepharia or an online Bible or a print Bible that has Psalm 13 in it. You needed my handout in order to be able to look at the Mesopotamian material, but you don't need it for Psalms. So we're going to start looking at Psalm 13 together in order to talk more about this grammar of Psalms, and even more importantly, to talk about the continuing value and viability of the genre of lament as a form of personal prayer in times of crisis. And as I think Betsy will see, the outcome will tie very nicely to the question that she posed. So first of all, we have a superscription, which we'll pass by in verse 1, for the leader, a psalm of David. This is a fascinating tradition and a fascinating problem, namely the notion of the development of the attribution of psalms to David and what the significance and meaning of that are. Okay, we begin right away with a complaint. Now, I'm going to distinguish between complaining and lamenting in a very simple way. Not everyone will agree with this, but I mean, you have to have multiple words, especially in the Jewish tradition, because we do a lot of kvetching, and you have to have nuanced forms of kvetching. The complaint is the direct attribution to what I'm enduring to God. In other words, when I complain to God, I'm saying, God, you've done this. When I lament, I'm talking more abstractly about my situation. I'm suffering, I'm crying. Not why are you making me cry or why are you allowing me to cry, but rather, how long? How long? Now, in the midst of our pandemic, that's got to be a lot of people's number one question. How long? How long? The uncertainty of duration. It's not like we want to have an answer that says, well, in 3 weeks and 2.5 hours. It's just that we want the uncertainty to be alleviated, some kind of confidence that we want to have instilled in us. And so we raise this question, how long, how long? How long will you hide your face from me? Remember the Mesopotamian prayer had talked about this notion. What do we invoke when we invoke the priestly blessing? We say, you know, may God cause God's countenance to shine upon you. The idea that experiencing the radiance of God's light in our lives is a source of blessing and comfort is here juxtaposed with its opposite, which is God hiding God's face rather than presenting God's face. The face of God in the ancient Near Eastern tradition is the very presence of God that's discernible existentially by us. We have lots of surrogates for God. You know the stories about Moses being told that he's unable to see God. So how do we quote unquote see God? Well, there are two principal ways that we see God. One is this metaphor of the face, the illumination that's provided by the feeling of divine presence in our lives, and the other is the name of God. When we utter the name of God, that's why there's such emphasis in the Ten Commandments and elsewhere about not taking the name of God in vain, because the name of God is God. It represents the divine presence when we utter it and when we invoke it. And so we see it right here. We see the question with the invocation of the name, with the accusation or complaint of having been forgotten. I directed a dissertation at Hebrew Union College many years ago on the language of abandonment, forgetting, hiding the face, abandoning, leaving, forsaking. Just as in English we have many words, in Hebrew there are many words. And it represents the principal spiritual psychological dilemma of the person who's praying, the feeling of being alone and abandoned. And you can see this. How long will you hide your face? Remember, face equals the literal presence of God that I experience. How long will I have cares in my mind, grief in my heart all day? And now we introduce an element that we don't have so prominently in the Mesopotamian literature, but we have in all of the biblical Psalms of Lament, of which there are about 50. And that's the presence of an enemy. How long will my enemy have the upper hand? If you're looking at the handout, this is at the top of page 2, or if you have any other Bible, it's at the end of Psalm 13, verse 3. How long will my enemy have the upper hand? So who's the enemy? That's a rhetorical question. Because the reason that these Psalms are preserved and the reason that they have so much life, so much vitality for continuing religious use is precisely because of the ambiguity of the terminology. What does it mean to you for God to be hiding God's face? Who or what is your enemy? Is the enemy something out there, someone out there? Is it an illness? Is it an injury? Is it a feeling? Is it a psychological state? Whatever the enemy is, you name it. You get it outside of yourself. You invoke God's anger against it. You exorcise it, as it were, And that's part of the prayerful process of engaging in lament. You take what's eating you up inside, and you get it outside of yourself, and you name it. And then you say, you petition God for what? Look at me, answer me. Restore the luster to my eyes. There's this notion that the sense of the divine presence is the sense that you have this illumination in your life, this inspiriting, this inspiration that comes from the divine presence. It's so remarkable. And again, it echoes the priestly blessing. And some of you may know that the very oldest piece of biblical literature that exists from an ancient Near Eastern excavation is a version of the priestly blessing that was excavated from a tomb on a piece of gold. It was inscribed on a piece of gold foil found in a place called Ketef Hinnom. And that tells you how important and how ancient that little bit of biblical blessing literature is, the priestly blessing that we now have preserved in the Bible and sometimes regarded as a separate book embedded within the Bible itself. Restore the luster to my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, I have overcome him. So we have complaint, following an invocation of God's name, and the complaint is in the question, how long? And in the statement about how this individual is suffering, and in the naming of the suffering by use of the term enemy, and that then leads to the petition. And the petition is for God to turn God's face back to us to provide the illumination that we so desperately seek in our lives, lest the enemy triumph. You can see there's a balance, and there are many other Psalms in which the complaint will be that God seems to be favoring the enemy, even though I'm the one that God should love. There are many Psalms in which I talk about the offering that I vow to give to God, should God answer my petition. There are Psalms in which God will say, in which I'll offer a confession and acknowledge my guilt and still plead with God for God's mercy. As I say, there are 50 of these. This is the simplest of them. And another one of the simple ones is the one that many of us say in the context of the service that's called Tachanun, the penitential service that's recited in connection with some services, which is Psalm 6. Psalm 6. And Psalm 6 is not only a primary penitential psalm for Jews, but it's also one of the standard repertoire of penitential psalms in the Christian tradition as well. So then what happens? Lest my enemies say, I have overcome him, my foes exult when I totter. But now look at verse 6. In Hebrew, Ba'ani b'chastecha patachti. But as for me, I feel secure, I feel trust in your chesed. Now, I mean, chesed means, after all, a term that we use all the time, but very few people know what it actually means because it's a very special term that has very special meaning in the context of biblical literature and within the Jewish tradition. Its primary meaning is that is a form of love for which we expect no reciprocation and for which that love will rarely be in a position to reciprocate anyway. So when we call upon God's chesed, what we're doing is invoking the love of someone who is unimaginably greater than we are to provide for us a boon for which we cannot possibly reciprocate. We can't possibly do anything except to call on divine grace to bestow this manifest love on us because God loves us, not because we can do anything in return. So this is gratuitous love, the love that a superior party can bestow upon an inferior party with no expectation of anything in return. Back to our original discussion of the difference between a covenantal religion and a personal religion. This term, to me, evokes the quintessence of the personal religion. the idea that we call on the love of God. The love of God in time of crisis, even though we're bereft of means on our own. Let my heart exult in your Yeshua, in your deliverance. And then the conclusion, this very mysterious conclusion, which is translated here by JPS, I will sing to the Lord, or maybe let me sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. He has been good to me. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, because you can assume that whatever the existential crisis that's being addressed here by this psalmist might have been, it hasn't been alleviated. If this is a psalm that's being uttered by someone on a sickbed, I doubt that that person has been healed by the act of 5.5 verses of praying. So what has happened? What has changed? What has changed is the mood. What has changed is the spirit. What has changed is the psychological outlook on the part of the person praying, who is looking desperately for an opportunity to praise God and seeks it in the recognition of God's gratuitous love. Yagel libi bishuatecha. Let my heart, my mind, that's what the heart is, extol your deliverance, your vindication of me, and let me sing to Adonai. Some people say, because he has been gracious to me in the past, God should be gracious in the future, but I don't think it's that at all. I think it kind of invokes in a kind of magical way the notion that the very act of prayer induces this feeling of comfort in divine presence and some kind of spiritual relief. The idea that the God who has turned away from me and hidden the divine face is now habita, repetition, looking upon me, caring about me, showing love to me. So that's Psalm 13, which is the simplest of all the Psalms of Lament in the Hebrew Bible. And I know you can see the parallels with the Mesopotamian material and also the distinctive aspect of the biblical psalm as well. I think this is a good moment to stop and see if there are some additional questions.
Looks like no questions right now.
Okay. Well, thank you. That brings me to the bleakest of all the biblical Psalms of Lament. Now, this concluding expression of comfort and confidence is a characteristic of the biblical genre. That there's some of trust or hope or expectation is characteristic of every psalm except one. And the one that doesn't have it is the other one in the handout, which is Psalm 88. This is not a psalm that we use frequently in our liturgy. And I think that is it's no mistake, because if the purpose of lament is to introduce at least some kind of spiritual or psychological relief, then this one's really a problem. On the other hand, in the years in which I've had the privilege of working on these psalms with pastoral counselors every year, a couple times a year, the students in our who are studying in our Center for Clinical Pastoral Education will ask me to talk about Psalms of Lament and other uses of Psalms with them. And we always bring up Psalm 88. And what the counselors always tell me is that they find a tremendous use for this Psalm because there are just some people who can't see their way out of the suffering. And they want their suffering validated as is without their feeling that they have to utter some kind of false statement of confidence that's not true to their own experience. And so the Bible gives them one of those. It gives them Psalm 88, which has a person crying out repeatedly to God and receiving no indication that relief is at hand, and yet there's continuing permission to cry out, continuing permission to lament, continuing permission to complain to the God who is still not answering. And that's a position that a lot of us find ourselves in. I know that a student of mine from pastoral counseling reported using this psalm frequently with substance abusers who are in rehab and are unable to see that out. And this psalm gives them, I wouldn't say relief, but it gives them some sense of sharing the experience of their being entrapped in suffering with others who've uttered this psalm in the past. Well, let's take a look at it. And for a few minutes, look at some of the imagery of it. So here we have Adonai Elohei Yeshuati, same language of God as the one who is the person, the one who is the individual who has the capacity to bring vindication or bring deliverance. Remember, I'm reflecting on myself, I'm reflecting on my own suffering, I'm articulating it, I'm trying to exorcise it by naming it and putting it outside of myself, but I'm also trying to connect it presumptuously to this great power that's out there that may or may not have the power and willingness to bring me some relief. And here's Psalm 88. I cry out in the night. The language is so rich. Tza'akti b'alayla negdecha. I just cry out to you every single night. Let my prayer reach you. Hear me. Incline your ear to my cry. Right? There are psalms that talk about God as if God were suddenly blind to the suffering that we endure, or deaf to the petitions that we utter. And we just want God to turn God's face towards us, to bring us the light of God's presence, to hear us, to see us. Zoom is a very poor surrogate for this. And I can tell you how my wife and I are experiencing this, this inability to see, inability to reach out and touch. For example, in connection with my wife's dad, who is 98 years old, and he lives in a nursing home that's a total of an 8-minute drive from us, and we can't see him. He's been in lockdown. He's had COVID, and at the age of 98, he survived it, and he's in fine shape now, but we can't see him. And that's good because, you know, it protects him and it protects us, but it's also awful. And as I said, Zoom is a rather poor surrogate for this notion of needing to be in the presence of community in order to have any hope of gaining the support and relief that the laments are intended to provide. I'm sated with misfortune. I'm at the brink of Sheol. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind in the back of your mind is that God, in the biblical tradition until its very latest phase, does not have sway over the realm of death. So when you die, then you're out of God's presence altogether. It's only in the very latest stages that you find in places like Isaiah chapter 27 or in the book of Daniel, where you see God having the power over the realm of death, having the power to resurrect the dead. Language of rescue from death or resurrection from death or rescue from Sheol in earlier biblical literature is always metaphoric. And it represents a kind of appeal, as it were, to God's interest to keep us alive. Ma betza b'domi b'ridati el shachat. Right? What's the gain for you, God, if I go down to the pit? Hayodecha afar? Is the dust going to offer praise to you? Or lo hametim yahalleluya v'lo kol yordei duma, from the Hallel Psalms, right? The dead don't praise God. So it's in God's interest to keep us around. So you've got me on the verge of the pit here. Don't you want to rescue me? I'm numbered with those who go down to the pit. I'm helpless. Together ain't eyal. The Meitim Chofshi, very interesting phraseology in verse 6, abandoned among the dead, but that's not a good translation because free is a euphemism in ancient Near Eastern literature for the netherworld, for the place of death. And, you know, for enslaved people or people who are suffering, the language of freedom, death as freedom, the Beit Chofshit, is a graveyard, or the netherworld, the place where free people go. And Job talks about being permitted to die, which is the realm where slaves are free of their masters because they're dead. So this is very powerful language, that I'm on the verge of death. You pay no mind to me. I am cut off from your care as if I were already dead. And you can only understand this in the context of the notion that God has no sway over the over the realm of death. And then at the very bottom in verse 9, if you're in the handout, here chakta miyudai mimeni. This is something Job complains about too. But you've done this, God. You've made those who are supposed to be my intimates. That's what miyudai, yada, to know in relational terms means to be in an intimate relationship between the subject and the object. Two people in intimate relationship. That's why yada, to know, has as one of its meaning to have sexual intercourse between couples, because it means to be in intimate relationship. How can I know God? Well, in a metaphoric way, in intimate relationship with the deity of whom I seek to have knowledge. So those who should be intimate with me are shunning me, and you've made me like a toeva, like a disgusting and repulsive thing to them. I'm shut in. I don't go out. Anybody who can't see the applicability of some of this language to the situation in which many of us regrettably find ourselves now is just missing the point. I mean, that this situation of being locked in a feeling of abandonment, hopelessness, helplessness is something that so many of us have experienced. I don't know when the last time you guys went out was. The last time that I went to New York was on March 6th. I was all just dressed up and ready to go to the JTS Purim Spiel on the evening of March 9th, and my phone was buzzing at 5:30 in the morning to tell me that everything was canceled. So I had to eat all the hamantashen myself. So, you know, there's an upside to everything. But seriously, this is a problem that we face in real life today. And so you see that it's addressed 1,500 years ago in the language of the book of Psalms. Is your faithful care recounted in the grave, your constancy in the place of perdition? So fear of death, which is something that we experience all the time amid the threat of the virus and amidst the pandemic, is here too. As for me, and now we return to the beginning, verse 14, Elecha Adonai Shivati. I cry out with petitionary pleas. Every morning my prayer greets you, and yet you reject me. You hide your face from me. I've been suffering for my entire life. I suffer your terrors, verse 17. In other words, the explicit complaint that this suffering comes from you. Is there any confessional element? Is there any effort at explanation? No, there's just an expression of abject misery, laid at the feet of God, as it were, with only God being the one who's able to provide any relief, and yet God refuses to do so. Your fury overwhelms me, your terror destroys me, just as in the complaints of Job. They swirl around me like water all day long. This evokes old cosmic imagery that we don't have time to go into, and you've made friend and neighbor distant from me. So let's take a couple questions, and then I'll conclude with a couple of improvised prayers that were collected by anthropologists working in South Africa.
George?
If we try and look at the Psalms in the terms of Buber, an I-thou versus an I-it relationship, what are we trying to get an I-thou relationship with God, and is God having an I-it relationship with us in these Psalms?
Well, no relationship at all. It is what one fears, that I'm simply forgotten, neglected, abandoned. If you look at the language of Psalm 23, one of the most interesting metaphors that it has, I assume pretty much everybody knows the 23rd Psalm here. So one of the most interesting metaphors that's not usually noticed is the positional metaphor. It starts out with the individual who's praying as the object who's being led around by God, right? God leads me, right? I'm trying to translate it into English in my head. But, you know, God leads me beside the still waters. I'm the object of God's who's the active. Then what happens in the middle of the psalm? I fear no evil because you are with me alongside. And then what happens at the end of the psalm? Surely justice and mercy shall pursue me all the days of my life. So, in other words, you have God in three different positions, or God's blessing in three different positions, leading me along, then alongside me, and then running after me as I move ahead in my life. And it's all those things. In other words, sometimes we get ahead of God. Sometimes we have God alongside us, and we need God alongside us. And sometimes we need to be led. We need to be nurtured in a way that God, as shepherd, is able to do. But they're all three in that one psalm, and they're all through the Psalms. And whether God is in an I-thou or I-it relationship with us is not a theological statement. It's a subjective psychological statement. It's a statement about how I feel. It's not a statement about what God is. One of the things that I love about the Bible is when people try to make theology about it. But one of the main purposes of the book of Job is to tell us that theology is all nonsense. That is to say, if we try to make objective statements, and we have Rambam as an authority on this, about what God is and what God does, we're just talking into the wind. We're making it up. And even what the Bible says about what God is and what God does is just the way people view what God is and what God does, in a way of trying to translate the nature of deity for us to make it comprehensible, to make it approachable, to make it understandable, and to make us want to cry out and establish relationship into that thing that's essentially incomprehensible. So, I mean, it's a wonderful question, but it's a question that ultimately comes back to us and our subjectivity in the way in which we discern our relationship to the thing that's outside of us, that has this powerful effect on our lives, and that has the potential to allow our lives to have some meaning outside our petty existence.
I'm just going to jump in.
Somebody wrote a note about how, if you can imagine it, it's not God. And I love that statement, right? And that reminds me of a famous essay I read, which I don't remember.
I'm just gonna pause you for one moment. Sorry, just
okay.
we're technically out of time. So
I'm sorry.
So you're welcome to. If you're game, then we can have you stay and take a few more questions, which we've often done. So I just wanted to release the people who had to go at this time. So first of all, thank you for for sharing this powerful genre with us and really making such direct and compelling connections to us, to connections for us to what we're experiencing today and this ancient literature. So thank you so much. I want to remind everyone to join us again next week with Professor Barbara Marin for exploring the theme of remembering crisis, and sort of remembering how will we look back on this after the fact through the poetry of Yehuda Amichai. And with that, I will, Professor Cooper, turn it back over to you because you were speaking so beautifully. I know there are more questions. So please, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week if you can join us.
Well, thanks. I certainly don't want to presume on your patience, but I do want to just say one thing about that statement, which I liked very much, and that is the essay that I read about Star Trek. And not to trivialize, but the question that the essayist raised was, can you really invent an alien? And the answer was, no, of course you can't. Because the idea of an alien as something completely outside our experience is exactly that. It's completely outside of our experience. Just like, you know, in those great gateways of ancient Assyria, of ancient Ashur, we have winged human-headed bulls. Those are fantastic creatures. No one's ever seen a winged human-headed bull, but people have seen human heads, and people have seen creatures with wings, and people have seen bulls. So big deal. You've taken stuff that you know existentially, and you've combined them into a new combination. But that's not something that never existed or couldn't exist, right? It's different from the idea that you could invent an alien. And the way you want to think of God, if you want to think in Star Trek terms, is exactly in terms of that kind of radical otherness that's beyond human conception, but that naturally has to be reduced for any shred of comprehensibility in some way to human language. So scripture speaks in human language, and all this stuff, as Rambam taught us, has to be regarded as metaphor reflective of the limitations of our own ability to understand.
Can I suggest that you take us through the last text, and then we'll do questions?
Sure, the last text. First of all, I wanted to create some symmetry by having the last text be the same as the Santos text. These are texts collected by anthropologists, improvised laments by HIV positive South Africans when the HIV epidemic was really raging there within the last decade. Look at the last one. Oh Lord, why me? Why have you deserted me? What have I done to deserve such punishment? That's the whole prayer. Well, what does that presume? It presumes things that you have no way of knowing. First of all, the assumption that the suffering comes from God. Second of all, that the suffering comes from God because of something I did. These are remarkable leaps, but they're essential leaps in my desperate effort to find some kind of connectedness and meaning in what I'm enduring. It's not just like the bumper sticker that says SHIT happens. It doesn't just happen, right? Aristotle says that even luck has a cause. It's not random. It's part of some complex system that, you know, is beyond our ability to fathom. And so that's that individual making all those assumptions for which there's no existential, no empirical evidence, but it's a kind of assumption that we all make and that I dare say many of us have to make. And then the other one just looks like more like conventional petitionary lament. You see the trials and tribulations. You see. There it is. We want God to exercise the senses that God doesn't literally have, right? Seeing, hearing, see us, hear us. The trials and tribulations. We're sick and tired. This is the most ancient Mesopotamian laments. Simply, you throw yourself at the mercy of deity. You love me, don't you? And if you love me and you care about me, how can you stand to see me suffering this way? Even if I did something wrong, so what? Don't you love me? Don't you still want me to live? Don't you want me to live longer, prosperous lives? You see our anger, pain, and suffering. We have no power. We ask you, Lord, to suppress HIV so that it will not spread and so that more people will live healthy lives. Is that hard to translate into COVID-19? I don't think so. And yet it represents a genre of prayer in this improvised form that we can trace back 4,000 years. So, Mr. Elstein writes, but we don't blame God for the current crisis. And now I can give one of my favorite answers. Who's this we person, Ki Masabi? You mean you don't? But there's an awful lot of people there who are looking for a larger realm of meaning. Yeah, I don't like when people use we to include me when I haven't given any approval for that. I mean, even though we do that every year on Yom Kippur when we say Ashamnu Bagadnu, right? Who's this we person that's committed all these sins? right? Wendy R. says it's human to want to blame someone, and I think that's absolutely true. And isn't it great how many people we have to blame? I'd say that it reminds me of my grandfather. Whenever the weather turned bad, and he'd say, "You see," and I can't really get his accent right. "It's the dem communists. It's the dem communists." So, you know, we can lay COVID at their feet too. And who knows? For all I know, maybe it even is. Okay, let's take the last few questions, and then we'll. Naomi, I know Naomi. Hi, Naomi. Why do we have to ask God for forgiveness? Now I lost the question. Wait, it's there. It's there in the chat, right? Oh, come on. There it is. Perhaps God has to do tshuva. That's so Kabbalistic. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. Wait a second. The answer is yeah. First of all, we don't know what God is doing. But the idea that emerges from the Kabbalah and its theurgy, which establishes a relationship between our actions and the divine response, which, you know, we can't go into in detail, would have God lamenting alongside us, would have God doing teshuvah along with our teshuvah, does have God leaving the divine abode in Yerushalayim and going with us into exile in Babel, does have God's presence, as faint and as indiscernible as it might have been in the camps. So there's a lot to be said on that topic, and it's very important that you raise it.
Marion?
There's such a panoply of comments, but I want to give people who want to talk and ask a question a moment to do that, please.
Marion?
Yeah, hi, Professor Cooper. I was looking at in Psalm 13, there's an implication on the part of the lamenter that God will care about the lamenter's enemies, even though they're not necessarily God's enemies. I mean, I'm used to seeing that more in, you know, as appealing to the divine ego. You know, your enemies will say you weren't strong enough.
Yes, right. Like what Moses, when Moses intervenes on behalf of the Egyptians, on behalf of the Israelites, and says, "But what will the Egyptians think if you let your people die in the wilderness?" Right? What you're doing is recognizing that Psalm 13, in terms of its motivational capability, in terms of the motivational aspect, is one of a panoply of options that are open to the psalmists in the context of their laments. So, for example, you can contrast two of the most famous communal laments, Psalm 44 and Psalm 74. In Psalm 44, the psalmist claims to have done absolutely nothing wrong and can't understand why God isn't intervening on behalf of the community, and it must be because God has fallen asleep. In Psalm 74, the psalmist recognizes in Psalm 74, the psalmist wants to deflect God's anger away from himself onto the enemy by convincing God rhetorically that the enemy of Israel, who's causing Israel to suffering, is actually God's enemy. So you should intervene on behalf of your enemy on your own behalf. It's not just our interest, it's actually in God's own interest to act on behalf of the enemy. All of this reflects what we might call the essential triangle of lament, in which there are three characters, right? You've got God at the top of the triangle, and you've got at the bottom, you've got the enemy, and you've got the person praying. There's no good word in English for that. Moshe Greenberg, my teacher, used the word prayer with a hyphen between pray and the person praying. Some people use penitent and some people use lamenter, but that's only for laments. But you can't, unfortunately, really, you don't have a good word in English. There's an imbalance in the flow of power. that's supposed to be directed for my benefit, but instead is flowing to the side of the enemy. And we want God to redirect that flow. Look at the conclusions of the 3rd and 4th chapters of the book of Lamentations. You see this really explicitly, this idea that the flow of power is going the wrong way. It's going in the wrong direction. What we want is for God to redirect it so that the blessing comes my way and the bad stuff goes where it belongs, which is against the enemy. Okay, I'm losing my voice, so maybe one more question and that's it, if there's one more.
Gary?
So one of the other things that's happening in our time is that people are becoming sensitized to injustice. And I think one of the positive things that potentially comes out of our time is the recognition, as Levinas would say, of the priority of ethics over ontology. That is the priority of our requirement to act on behalf of others who are oppressed over our own self-interest. And I wonder if you would comment on that as, you know, as a concern in the context of lament. That is, lament as an activating process rather than as a process that leads us further down into depression.
Well, it's a really interesting point because it represents a complete reinterpretation of the biblical system of religion and the biblical worldview generally, which we've undertaken in our time. In other words, to reinterpret the Bible so that it becomes a source book for social justice, which is a concept that emerges only in the 19th century and which actually is alien to the biblical mentality about the nature of justice and the nature of human obligation, is one of the fascinating development. And what you've just done is describe part of that process of transformation, of that reinterpretation of the biblical ideas, which are Israelocentric, Judeo-centric, which are hierarchical, and which do not condemn what we would nowadays call as self-centered and hierarchical and I'm trying to remember the other word, non-egalitarian modes of social organization and personal conduct. So, for example, when we talk about egalitarianism, we're talking about something completely different from the way the Bible describes the obligation of the wealthy to care for those who are less fortunate. There's no egalitarian strain there whatsoever, only a kind of obligation imposed on those who are better off to take care of those who are less well off, but not to forsake the benefits that they have or the blessings that they have for the sake of others. So what you're doing is talking about a different ethical construction, which I think is really, it's at the center of our, is at the center of the social revolutions that occur in the 19th century and continuing to the present day. It's one of the reasons that so many Jews who were alienated from the Jewish system of religion in the 19th century became communists and brought these social ideals to America with the great immigration at the turn of the 20th century. We, continue to experience their influence. But it's a huge topic that you've raised, and I thank you for doing that. But how we affect that translation and remain true, at least to this revised and renewed spirit of biblical literature and the Jewish tradition, is a really fascinating question that requires a very deep and long consideration. Thanks for raising it.
Okay, I think if that's an end, then we'll say goodbye. Thank you to everyone, and have a good week.
Thanks. Wonderful seeing everyone, and stay well and in good spirits.